I hope you've got a cup of tea. I do. This is going to be one whopper of a review, because the novel that I've been reading for, the volume that I've been reading for the last few days, and that's a long time for me, is Tales of Fantasy, Elsewhere Volume 2, and it's edited by Terri Windling, can't pronounce it, Windling, and Mark Allen Arnold. Now, I've never heard of Mark Allen Arnold. I googled him. Google doesn't know much about him either. But of course, Terri Windling is very well known. She's an American author who wrote fantasy and mythic fantasy. I think she was responsible for coining a couple of genres like mythic poetic and mythic fantasy. I guess a lot of what she writes would be called magical realism today, but a few of the terms coined by her generation have persevered. The reason I'm holding this up, because look at that fabulous artwork. Even if nothing else, that cover art is spectacular, and you could almost buy it for that alone. And the cover art is done by an artist I hadn't heard of, George D. Hoff. Now, throughout this collection, and it's short stories and poems and a couple of strange little things. I don't know what they are. It's a page of stream of consciousness. Is that a poem? It doesn't rhyme. I'm old school about these things. Now, throughout the novel, many stories have got their own little illustrations by Terri Windling that were done, and some of them are quite spectacular. This one, it doesn't look as good on the screen as it does in the book, but there's some beauties. Now, as to the volume itself, this is the third time I've owned it. I bought it in the recent book haul from Brisbane, but the first time I owned it was when I was living in Melbourne. It wasn't so much second hand when I got it as 17th hand. It was in hideous condition. I don't think the cover was attached anymore, and when I moved north, I left it behind. While I was living in North Queensland, I missed a couple of the stories in it, and I found it in a second hand shop, and I bought it again. Again, not as good condition as this volume is. It had the price written on the cover in Texter, for example, and I left that behind when I moved southward. An interesting point about Tales of Fantasy Elsewhere Volume 2, with that spectacularly beautiful cover, is that there are actually 3 in the series, and I've never actually set eyes on volumes 1 and 3 except on the internet. So I don't know what they're like. This must be the one that they overprinted or that a lot of people get rid of to op shops. But it's a good collection. Now, I often say that I don't like short story collections. They're not my favourite. They're hard to read. But, well, I won't rave about that again. I'm sure I've raved about why I don't like short story collections in other videos. But I do like old school fantasy and science fiction. And short stories and novellas are where they started in America in all the magazines. And so I'm reading them. I'm getting back into reading them, and I'll stop whinging about them. However, you never like all the stories. You can't go from one to the other, so they're not a fast reading proposition. You never like all of them, so that makes me tetchy, because you have to review the volume as a whole, and you're not being fair to the really good authors if you give it a 3-star review, and you're being way too fair to the stories you really didn't enjoy. Anyway, in this amazing volume, illustrated with little wizards and butterflies, because Terri is an amazing artist. I don't have many books of hers, by the way. I do have The Woodwife, but I don't have too many of her other volumes. I think I had them once, but they're hard to find now. There's some beautiful knotwork of probably Celtic, but I'm going to go Scandinavian style as well. You see something similar to this on a lot of the runestones, so beautiful border. And now we come to the table of contents with its very own very pretty illustration. As you can see, there's a few of them. But wait, there's more. There's a whole other page of more. In total, this volume contains 33 articles, events, stories, or poems. Sorry. And that includes the introduction, because the introduction is really good. It has a good take on dreams, subgenre of fantasy, which I mentioned earlier, and the effect of mythic, poetic, and fairy tale, which is very much Terri's thing, on stories. 33. I'm not going to be able to say very much about many of them, but I did make notes as I was reading over the last few days, because that's the only way you're going to keep track of 33. So, quick mention of many things. The very first item is called In the Very Earliest Time, and it's an Eskimo chant. It's quite interesting if you're into that sort of thing. Number 2 is called Junction's Pleasure by Richard Engelhardt. That's the artwork for it. And the artwork is good, and the story is a gorgeous little vignette, I suppose is the word, by Richard Engelhardt. I didn't remember it well, but I did remember enjoying it. It's about an old magician who's reached the end of his working life, and he'd made a deal with a sort of supernatural-ish type entity type thing, that he would have a son. He would have a son to pass on his magic to. No son is eventuated. If he dies without passing on his skills, they're all lost, etc., etc. There's stuff and things, but basically, he's old and grumpy, and until a magic talking raven called Agapes teaches him to look around at the world around him, the people, and how to feel like a human again. It's a story in which he has to confront his best student who wants to do heinous things to him. It's a beautiful little story. 5 stars for that story. I remembered it. I enjoyed it. I loved reading it again. Next, you've got The Urn Queen by Jane Newbold. I'd probably give that story on its own 4-star. It's got that detached storytelling method that, as I read through this book, I remembered was very much a thing in early fantasy. It's like third person, quiet narration, silent narration, detached and unemotional quite often, even when you're talking about very major events. So I think that the storytelling didn't do this story any favour. I have read more by Jane Newbold. I think she writes very well. This is a sort of story about animal to human transformation, but with a light touch. It's not the shapeshifter type, in your face, smack you over the head style of writing that you get in most shapeshifter and supernatural romance type things today. It's very subtle, it's very dark, yes, and detailed, but light hand. So one thing I liked about it was there's a nod to an older woman character, and a nod to going a Viking. I hadn't remembered that there was Viking connotations in this book. There's much about it I hadn't. Now, next we get a song or a poem called, I think most people would pronounce this Gwydions, but it's a Welsh word, so the W should be 2 O's. Gwydions Loss, something like that. Of Thu by Alan Kushner. The Welsh feel was cool, but it's a poem, and I often don't see the point of view of poems in fantasy. I get that people loved it. It took me a while even to come around to Tolkien's poetry. Now, next we've got a short story. It's called Amigo Heliotropo by Felix Martí Ibanez. That's the heliotrope image that I showed you earlier as the beginning to it. I didn't finish it at the first try. I tried 2 pages and my mind just kept drifting away. You know how sometimes it's the writing style itself that hooks you, and that, like Roger Zelazny, like Terry Pratchett, probably they could write a shopping list and you would be enthralled because there's just some zing to their writing that meshes with your brain. Felix Martí Ibanez's writing did not mesh with my brain. There was an element of quirky yet elaborate that I couldn't get into at first. When I tried it again later, though, I did finish it. It's a whimsical story of a stranger who joins a circus that's travelling through South America. It's heavy on the whimsy. The ending is really good, and I did enjoy it later, even though I wasn't thrilled about it at first. Now, story number 6 is called The Golden Goat by Michael de Larabetti. It's got a nice little illustration to it. And it's a good solid fairy tale style. And it's one of the cautionary tales about trusting the supernatural. The setting is nice. I'm not sure I know who Michael de Larabetti is, but I enjoyed this. I enjoyed this fairy tale element, which is very much a Terri Windling influence, I suspect. And I enjoyed the fact that it had a Moorish influence, because having a fairy tale set elsewhere is apparently a thing I really like. Number 7 was a poem, and I just thought it was meh, whatever, another poem, whatever. Number 8 was The Fallen Country. The Fallen Country is written by Somtau Sucharitkul. I'd love to know where that name came from. I'm feeling it maybe even Thai, but anyway. The story itself is a really interesting, I'd probably 4-star it if I was reviewing it on its own. It's kind of where fantasy and child abuse intersect, which doesn't sound terribly promising really, does it? But what you've got is you've got a modern day psychologist in a school, small town, nothing big. She's older, she's not very interested, she's just doing her job. And a boy comes to her for consultation. It's obvious that he's being abused at home, but she's been down this road before and she knows there's not much you can do. It's set in America. And this compilation is probably from an era where child abuse was really common, early 80s. And often there wasn't very much you could do about it. So anyway, she keeps seeing this boy, and one of the problems he has at home is that he keeps being accused of lying, and he's telling her these amazing fantasy stories where he goes into a country of cold and there's an ice dragon. I've encountered plenty of stories where cold is used as a method of dealing with emotional pain. I think Mercedes Lackey did it very well in Vaniel's Tale, but many other people have done it as well. This is a good little story. It's interesting to see the older woman who's a psychologist being drawn into this world that Billy has. And the reason he went to her in the first place, by the way, is because he was found one day on a church spire and no one could figure out how he got there. And him telling people that he got there from another world where the ice dragon left him didn't really help his case very much. Anyway, really enjoyed this little story. Now, the next one is a poem. It's called Small Dragon by Brian Patton. I think there is actually a pattern, of how the poems intersect with the stories a little bit. And I did like Small Dragon. It is quite a small poem as well. It meshed. Enjoyed it. Next comes a long, dare I say, epic poem. Maybe. Written by Anne Sexton. It's called The 12 Dancing Princesses. And it obviously is a modern poetic retelling of what happened with 12 Dancing Princesses mythology. This poem is great. It has stayed with me throughout the years. I'd copied down a part of it, but it's quite a long poem and I hadn't copied it down in its entirety. It's really good to read again. It's every bit as vivid as I remembered. The first stanza, I guess, if 2 lines is a stanza, is, if you danced from midnight to 6 a.m., who would understand? And then it goes through some of the people who would understand, and the insomniac. This is brilliant. The insomniac, listening to his heart thumping like a June bug, listening on his transistor to Long John Nebel arguing from New York, lying on his bed like a stone table, would understand. Who hasn't been sleepless and felt like their bed was a stone table in a morgue? Dark, dark. And then it goes into the actual story of how the dancing princesses were caught. It combines mythic type wording with very modern similes. I think there's a fire hydrant in there somewhere. Oh no, here we go. Next came the ball where the shoes did duty. The princesses danced like taxi girls at Roseland. I've got no idea what taxi girls at Roseland is, but it's very evocative. Okay. Enough of the 12 Dancing Princesses. I could probably do a whole video on it. Do you want a whole video on it? I would do a whole video on it. Anyway, next we've got number 11 is The Courtship of Mr Lion by Angela Carter. Again, with a really nice illustration. This might very well have been the very first Angela Carter I ever read. It's a Beauty and the Beast retelling, obviously. Courtship of Mr Lion, indeed. So in this one, Angela Carter has that same detached storytelling element that so many of these fantasy stories do have. And Angela Carter was a phase that I went through, and this story very much belongs to that phase. If you enjoy Angela Carter, you'll like it. If you don't particularly enjoy Angela Carter, you might not quite understand what she's doing here with the character of Beauty, and you might not quite get what the ending is. The ending is... It feels like it should be a sort of meh ending, but I think she's making a point. It could be several points. I'm not sure which ones. Okay, next we have a very meh poem about a swan, accompanied by a not too bad illustration. Then we have number 13, In the Hall of Grief by Jane Yolen. Again, this might well have been the very first Jane Yolen that I ever read. Look at that illustration. It's so perfect for the story. There aren't climbing roses in the story, but otherwise it's perfect. This story I'd remembered quite well, and I was really happy to reread again. Jane Yolen is a good author, and I've read a few other things by her since. In this story, an older woman is looking back over her life back to when she was 13. She lives in a matriarchal society which has been slowly subsumed into a patriarchal society, and she's regretting that. But in the society she grew up in, grieving as in grief for the dead is an honoured profession, and she became famous for her threnodies, an excellent word that basically means a lament or poem. I had to look that up, by the way. So this is a really interesting story. It's not particularly short. It's very evocative. It's well written and it's well constructed. So you see the world she comes from through the eyes of her regret as she's nearing the end of her life. It subtly describes this very interesting, very different society. It takes no moral stances or judgments at all, and a couple of things in it are very amoral. I feel like Jane Yolen may have been influenced by reading stories of biblical antiquity times when grieving was a profession that you could hire people for. The next one is, moving forward, 14. Poem. Meh. Whatever. You do you. Then we've got 15 is The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World. What a title, hey? It's written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is the illustration. I don't know why it's got a tale for children written on it, because I'm not sure that it really is. Nice illustration though. Now, Gabriel Garcia Marquez is someone who I thought I was really going to like. When people first started raving about Love in the Time of Cholera and 100 Years of Silence, 1,000 Years of Silence, Some Years of Silence, I kind of remembered the name. And from this novel, I realised that I remember his name from fantasy collections, which I enjoyed. I think he does excellent stories. I loathed Love in the Time of Cholera, but that's a different video. The writing has the beauty, the spectacular, the emotive pull, which is what I expected from his full novel and totally failed to find. So, for example, one paragraph that I really loved in this book was, "Sink easily into the deepest waves where fish are blind and divers die of nostalgia." It's just like, wow, lush. It's lush. Anyway, beautiful, 5 stars, quite liked it. Next we have yet another poem. This one's I quite liked it. Haunted by R.P. Lister, of whom I've never heard. And it's very much a fantasy poem, and it's got its own little illustration, but it's not bad. It's still a poem. Then we've got Visitors to the Castle by Sylvia Townsend Warner. I feel like I have read other of her stories, but I don't remember them well. This is wonderful. It's funny. It's this wildly crazy story about a group of Welsh fairies who live on a mountain. A missionary from, I'm going to say probably Ireland, comes ashore and tells them that faith can move mountains, and they decide to try that. Only they don't have faith, and he tells them they don't have souls, and they kind of resent that, and they're gonna show that they can still do the thing. They don't go for faith, they go for singing. So they sing until the mountain goes away. The mountain comes back later, but the mountain keeps appearing and disappearing for a long time. It's a really quirky, it is quite wild. Loved the hell out of it. Visitors to a Castle. The ending's dark. I like it. I don't know how else you could finish a story like this as well. Next, we have a poem that I actually did really enjoy, to my own startlement. See, I can keep an open mind if I try hard. It's called A Tourist Camped on a Donegal Field by Bellamy Bach. And it is about a human who camps on a field and traps a leprechaun for very unexpected reasons. He isn't interested in the gold. He's got other things in mind. I really enjoyed that. Now, this next one. Gran and the Roaring Boys by Jenny Sullivan. I'm not sure I know Jenny Sullivan. I think I might. But this story I absolutely recommended, and I was absolutely remembered. Words. I remembered it and I recommend it. It's called Gran and the Roaring Boys. What I hadn't remembered was that it had a Welsh flavour. Perhaps I hadn't been as into Welsh stuff when I last read this book, or maybe I didn't know what Bodada meant yet. Anyway, now I do. It's witchy. It's light witchy. It's modern day witchy. Gran is known around Aberthuven, I think it's pronounced, as, well, they don't call it a witch, because, of course, they're very chapel. But she can witch when she wants to, and when provoked, she actually witches very, very well. Great story. Now, I think there's another pointless poem after that one. Yeah, poem, pointless, meh, whatever. Next is The Little Dirty Girl by Joanna Russ. Now, Joanna Russ was definitely a well-known author in her own right for the 80s, maybe in the 70s as well. I don't know when she came on the scene. Recently, she's been getting a lot more notoriety, traction, acknowledgement, I don't know, one of those things, for one or two of her books, but she wrote a lot. And she's got a style. If you like Joanna Russ' style, rather than saying, oh, I read The Female Man by Joanna Russ, which is a whole different story, if you like her actual style, you will enjoy this book. I did remember it. It's about an older woman who, at the beginning, cats and little boys are attracted to her, and she doesn't like cats or little boys. And then a little dirty girl attaches herself to her, and it slowly becomes clear that she's not a real girl. She's maybe a ghost, but she's a kind of weird ghost, and a very personalised one. A main character in this story is the city of Seattle, which I don't know and don't care very much, to be honest. It's vivid writing. It's an odd and interesting story. I think it's meant to talk about recovering from your childhood, or making peace with child abuse, or something. It's very Joanna Russ. What can I really say about it? Did I love it? No. Did I hate it? No. Will I think about it? Yeah, I even remembered it from all those years ago. But how I feel about it is really indeterminate. I'd be interested to see what other people thought of it, because, yeah, I don't know. Okay, next, we've got another story, and not a poem, thank goodness. It's called A Young Man Gleaming White by João Guimarães Rosa. I've mispronounced that hideously, I'm certain, and it's translated by Barbara Shelby. Nice little illustration. It's a little bit formulaic and formal, but it's the story. It's a nice little story about a mysterious man who, yes, does indeed gleam white, and who appears mysteriously in a village after a disaster. Most people assume he's been displaced, he can't talk. He's up to the reader, he's obviously not human. What is he? Is he an angel? Is he a saint? Is he an alien? There's a high possibility for alien on this, but you never really find out. It's an odd and absorbing little story that doesn't really go a whole heap of anywhere, but it's nicely written and entertaining. Okay, now comes a dark story. It's called Cerridwen and the Quern of Time by Paul Hazel. Still haven't figured out what a quern is, but never mind. A nice illustration that gives you a good feeling of the fates and a little bit of Celtic knotwork down the bottom there that isn't coming into focus. Anyway, Paul Hazel I don't know at all. He writes a good yarn though. This is an old Cerridwen. She's living in possibly an island or coastal community on her own. She's been there for a very, very long time. She's not connected to people because they're so ephemeral. She sees them come and go and die like March flies pretty much. What she does with her time is spin the sun in its courses. So she has to spin the sun to rise and the sun to set. The feeling of the story is mythic and dark, and I found it very enjoyable, like a, 80% dark chocolate, fair trade chocolate, of course, chocolate bar. Enjoyed it. I have no idea what that ending was. If anyone has read this and understood the ending, please do let me know, because I am completely mystified. Next, we have another story. Oh, this was a good one. The Ship from Away by Evangeline Walton. Another nice little illustration, line drawing. This is told by a young man to the person who's writing the story down. He went to Scotland to stay with a whole heap of friends. He took a boat out one day because he wasn't into hunting, and he saw a mysterious, scary ferry boat which he ran away from. But as he's telling the story, it's clear that he's drawn to it as much as he's scared of it, and the end of the story is surprising no one when the author of it finds out that he's gone back to Scotland and his mother found him drowned on the shore. It's a very Tuatha De Danann type fairy tale, where following the fairies is dangerous and, in this case, fatal. Here's the thing. The Day the World Died by Thomas Willoch. It's a thing. It's a something. It's not a poem. It doesn't rhyme. It doesn't have stanzas. It's just a blur. It's not a story because it doesn't have any of the things the story needs, like structure, aims, goals. I don't know. Nothing. I don't know. Whatever. Terri Windling, you're doing well by me. I can't object too much to 26. Blood and Dreams is next by Richard Monaco. A nice little illustration. It's a marvellous little story about Percival from King Arthur's table, King Arthur's court. I haven't liked many of the King Arthur retellings that I've read. In fact, I haven't thoroughly enjoyed any of them at all. I've read quite a few. Please don't anyone want to shoot me on this one, but they're just not my thing. They tend to take themselves too seriously. I'm willing to concede that Arthur probably had no sense of humour, but the author who's writing him down should. Richard Monaco has humour and to spare. In this one, Percival decides he's sick of being King Arthur's virtual assassin, so he tells King Arthur where he can shove his round table and heads off to go home to the wife he doesn't like. On the way, he's waylaid by a witch and then some random people who kidnap and torture him and force him out of his famous red armour, and then a whole heap of other people turn up. Everyone's hunting the Grail except for Percival. Percival doesn't want anything to do with the Grail, and he would like everyone to leave him alone. Thank you very much, but they won't. They're sure that he can get the Grail for it. It's a wonderful book. It's funny and it's enjoyable. Next we have another poem, The Trash Dragon of Shenshi. Andrew Glaser wrote it, and I actually didn't hate it. I see what you're trying to do there. Kinda. I mean, I've already talked about it more than it deserves. Okay, 29. Story 29 is The Vanishing Trolls by Gerd Wallach. Nice little illustration there. Like the illustration, very suited to the story. And the story is really good. It's fun. It feels like it's got a strong Nordic influence. I don't know this Gerd Wellig. Maybe he's Norwegian. It's a story about a family who's getting together for Christmas, seen through the eyes of the grandfather, or in some cases the great-grandfather. He's got a little granddaughter or great-granddaughter. Is it great-granddaughter? I think it is. And who is very mischievous. Yes, great-granddaughter. She's playing cruel tricks, and he decides to trick her with a story of the trolls into behaving. And it's a great story all the way through, but the end is a complete twist, because was he kidding? You've got to think about it. I thought about it a lot. It's a very tricksy little story, and I loved it. Next, we've got a poem, The Magic Wood by Henry Teese. It's a rhyme that might be okay if it was set to music, but, you know, meh, whatever. And next we have The Healer by Robin McKinley. Beautiful illustration for this one. Now, I'm very fond of Robin McKinley. The Blue Sword by her and a few other ones I've really enjoyed. I think I've even reviewed a few of them on YouTube already. Much as I like her as an author, I don't feel like this is her best work. Most of it feels like a standard medieval fantasy. Right at the end, it turns into a bit of a Daymar story, which is her world she wrote The Blue Sword in. Anyone who loves Daymar will enjoy the appearance of Luth in it. If you're not fond of Daymar stories, or if you don't really know Robin McKinley, you can probably still enjoy it, but it will feel a lot like a Deus Ex Machina when Luth appears to solve all the problems. He does that, though. It's not my favourite by her. I actually had to try several times to get through the story, which is certainly not my normal experience with Robin McKinley. Normally she sucks me in straight away. Then we have a whole page dedicated to our little wizard and butterflies, which I say he deserves because he's a good wizard and butterflies. The next one is called The Harrowing of the Dragon of Horsebreath by Patricia A. McKillop. The picture is okay, not really worth showing. So it's medieval fantasy. You have a brief nod at the beginning to the fact that it's a different planet because there's two suns. It's a sneaky reference and it doesn't really go anywhere after that. I like Patricia A. McKillop. I've read a lot of her books. I've even held on to a few of them. I didn't love this one, and I think it's a me problem, but maybe not. So in The Harrowing of the Dragon, the point of view is a young woman living on a small ice island where people mine for all of the year except for 1 month when it briefly gets warm enough to leave the frozen, icicle-laden land where they burrow through tunnels to get gold, to go to the mainland and buy some things. A kid who used to belong there comes back. He never came back to become a miner. He went on to be a dragon harrower because dragons are a thing. And instead of killing them, what you apparently do is harrow them until they leave. Like I said, it's probably a me problem, but I didn't love this. Possibly because I'm also reading The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson at the same time. But this one felt like one person's hubris out to cause ecological destruction for personal gain and personal reasons. The dragon doesn't particularly need to be harrowed. No one has any problems that need solving. They're perfectly happy with their life, so leave them the hell alone and stop ruining their ecology. I found it a joyless sort of story. The long description of him and the dragon fighting had elements of beauty to the writing, but I couldn't engage with it. So I skim read. Now, I don't know if the author's intent was to do a fantasy version of The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, but it is. If that was your intention, Patricia, congrats, it worked. But it left a nasty bitter taste in the mouth. I'm sure it did appeal to many people, would appeal to many people. It's a good message if that's the message. But a book needs more than a message. It needs to be enjoyable. So, having read that, I was a bit off this book. I went away from it for a while to give myself a breather for the last story, number 33 by Fritz Lieber, who I love nearly as much as I love Roger Zelazny. The Moon Portal has got a strange little illustration to it, which fits in with the story very well. It's delightful. It's quirky and a little bit... It's definitely adult. It's not smart per se as such, but it's got adult concepts and it's got adults behaving in ways that adults behave, with a lot of humour and irony addressing the way they're behaving. The moon's portal is actually possibly a real thing, and it's strange. It revolves around a building where there's some sort of society of people who like theosophical stuff meeting. I did feel tinges of spiritualism and the actual theosophical society here. But as we continued on with the main character and the person who's spying on her and the whole building thing, I got strong lashings of the Green Millennium, which is a brilliant book by Fritz Lieber. It's the first one of his I ever read. I should reread it. It's up there. I never ever let go of that book because I want to reread it. With Fritz Lieber's writing, it's the writing that grabs me. The story is almost incidental, but it is a great story in itself. Rightio, that's the last of the stories, and at the end we have got another little line drawing illustration, and then we have a whole heap of contributors' notes. So there's a lot in here that you're not going to find on the internets either. So if you're interested in any of these authors, any of these stories or poems, this is where you're going to find the info. What a mission! I think this is my longest video ever, but what do you do with 33 stories to review? Anyway, if you've made it this far, thank you very much for making this far. YouTube loves it when people watch all the way through, and apparently it helps my algorithm. Have a good day. Next time I'm going for a shorter one.